There is a story that lives on the internet. It says that somewhere beneath the Great Smoky Mountains there is a buried world, not a cave, not an old mine, a civilization. Whole streets, whole buildings, swallowed in a single catastrophe that history supposedly chose to forget. And the story goes one step further. It claims the Cherokee wrote it all down, sometime around 1888, and that the record was quietly erased before the rest of us could read it. It is a haunting idea. It pulls you in, and it holds on. But when you actually go looking for that 1888 document, you find something stranger than the legend itself. Because a man really was living among the Cherokee in those exact years, writing down everything they would tell him. And what he recorded about these mountains, about mud, about a people who vanished into the earth, is real. It survived. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Survived. It just isn't the story the internet is selling you. So today we are going to do something the legend never does. We are going to go and look. Let's start with the theory, because you have probably already seen pieces of it without knowing what it was. Scroll long enough through certain corners of the internet and you will run into it. They call it the mud flood. The idea is simple, and that simplicity is part of why it spread so fast. Somewhere in the recent past, maybe 200 years ago, maybe less, a global cataclysm buried the bottom floors of buildings all over the world in a wave of mud and silt. The believers point to old European townhouses, with windows half sunk below the modern sidewalk. They point to grand train stations and courthouses that seem far too ornate, far too enormous for the small populations that supposedly built them. And they tie it all to a lost empire, an advanced civilization they call Tartaria, wiped from the maps and scrubbed from the schoolbooks. It sounds absurd when you say it out loud, and most of it is. But here is the uncomfortable thing about the mud flood theory. It survives not because the evidence is strong, but because the feeling is. Every one of us has walked through an old part of a city and felt it, that quiet sense that the people who came before us built something we could not build now, that something has been lost. The theory takes that feeling, that ache, and hands you a villain and a date, and it comes with a whole machinery of evidence, if you can call it that. The believers point to the great world's fairs of the late 1800s, those enormous white cities of domes and columns that were built for a single season and then torn down, and they ask how a civilization could throw up marble palaces overnight and then simply demolish them. They talk about a great reset, a moment where the timeline was rewritten and the survivors were fed a false history and told it had always been this way. They collect old photographs of half-sunk windows and mismatched brickwork and empty, oversized streets, and they arrange them into a case. None of it holds together under real scrutiny. The World's Fair buildings were temporary by design, made of plaster over wood frames, never meant to last. The sunken windows are the result of cities raising their street levels over time, which is ordinary and well recorded. But scrutiny is slow, and a good photograph is fast, and the theory keeps moving, because it never has to stop and prove anything. It only has to make you feel the loss. And of all the places this theory has latched onto, few fit the mood better than the Smokies. Think about what these mountains actually look like on an ordinary morning. Before the sun burns it off, the whole range breathes. A pale blue smoke rises straight out of the trees and pools in the valleys, thick enough to hide a whole town. The Cherokee had a name for this place long before the tourists arrived. They called it Shakanaj, the land of the blue smoke. The Europeans just translated the feeling and kept the name. That smoke is real, and there is a real explanation for it. The forest here is one of the densest and most diverse in all of North America. This is one of the great strongholds of temperate life on the planet. Thousands of species of plants and animals crowd into these ridges, so many kinds of salamander that biologists sometimes call the Smokies the salamander capital of the world. So many trees and flowers and mosses layered on top of one another that scientists are still cataloguing species here that exist nowhere else. All that living matter breathes out organic compounds into the air, and those compounds scatter the light and give the rising haze its blue tint. It is chemistry. It is beautiful, ordinary chemistry, the sheer weight of life exhaling all at once. But knowing the science does not kill the feeling. Stand at an overlook at dawn, watch the fog swallow an entire hollow until only the tips of the ridges show, and some old part of your brain whispers the same thing it whispered to everyone who ever stood here. Something down there is hidden. Something down there is covered up. The theory feeds on that whisper, and it finds more to work with the deeper you go. Because the Smokies do bury things. That part is not a legend. It is simply true, and it happens on a scale that surprises people. The soil here is deep and old and hungry. Leave a cabin standing empty for 50 years in these mountains, and the forest does not just grow around it, it grows over it. Moss takes the roof. Roots crack the foundation. Leaf litter piles against the walls, year after year, decade after decade, until the floor of the building is below the floor of the forest. Come back a lifetime later and you might walk right over the roofline of a home and never know a family once lived and died there. There is a version of a buried civilization in these mountains. It is real, it is documented, and we are going to get to it. But it is not the one the internet promised. To find it, we have to meet the man who actually wrote things down. His name was James Mooney. In the late 1880s, while the mud flood believers imagined some grand catastrophe being recorded and hidden, a young ethnographer from the Bureau of American Ethnology packed up and went into the mountains of western North Carolina to live among the eastern band of the Cherokee. This was the community that had refused to leave. Decades earlier, most of the Cherokee Nation had been forced west at gunpoint along the route we now call the Trail of Tears. But a stubborn remnant had hidden in these very ridges and hollows, in the shadow of the blue smoke, and held on to the only homeland they had ever known. Mooney did something that was rare for his time. He listened. He learned enough of the language to follow the old men when they spoke. He sat with the medicine keepers, the storytellers, the last people alive who carried traditions that reached back centuries before any European set foot on the continent, and he wrote it all down, page after page after page. The work he produced, published as The Myths of the Cherokee, is one of the most complete records we have of how these people understood the world and the mountains they lived in. So here is the honest truth about that 1,888 document. There is no secret Cherokee report of a mud flood being covered up by the government. That part is invented, but the era is right. The place is right. A man really was recording Cherokee memory in those exact years, and what he found, when it comes to mud and to buried worlds, is genuinely stranger than the fiction. Because listen to how the Cherokee said the world began. In the beginning, they told Mooney, there was no land at all, only water, stretching in every direction, and a sky vault of solid rock arching over it. All the animals lived up above, crowded together in the world beyond the sky, and it was getting too full. They wanted room. They wanted to know if there was anything solid down below the endless water. So a small creature volunteered, the water beetle. In the Cherokee telling, it is called Diuni's Sea, the beaver's grandchild. It darted down and skimmed across the surface of the water, looking for solid ground, and found none. Then it dove, down and down, into the dark water until it reached the bottom. And when it came back up, it carried something on its back. Soft mud. That mud began to grow. It spread out across the surface of the water in every direction until it became an island. That island is the earth. And in the oldest Cherokee understanding, the whole world, the ground under your feet right now, was pulled up out of deep water as a handful of wet mud that simply kept growing. Sit with that for a second. Before there was a printing press, before there was a mud flood video, before there was any of it, the people of these mountains were already telling a story in which the land itself is made of mud that rose out of a flood of water. The internet did not discover that connection. It stumbled into the edge of something the Cherokee had held for a very long time, and then it got the details completely wrong. And the story does not stop there. It gets more specific. It gets local. The mud island was new. the Cherokee said, and it was soft, too soft and too wet to stand on. So the animals kept sending down birds to check whether it had dried enough to live on, and every time the birds came back and said the ground was still wet. Finally, they sent down the great buzzard, the grandfather of all the buzzards we see today. He flew low over the new earth, back and forth, searching for dry land, but it was a long way, and his wings grew tired. And as he passed over the country that would one day belong to the Cherokee, his great wings began to strike the soft ground. Every time a wingtip came down, it dug a valley. Every time it swept up, it raised a mountain. The other animals, watching from above, grew afraid. If the buzzard kept going, the whole world would be nothing but mountains, so they called him back. But it was too late for this one stretch of the earth. The damage, if you want to call it that, was already done. And that, the Cherokee told James Mooney in the 1880s, is why the Cherokee country is so full of mountains to this day. Think about what that actually means. In the tradition of the people who lived here longest, these ridges and hollows, these exact peaks wrapped in blue smoke, were carved into existence when the earth was still wet mud. Not buried by mud in a catastrophe. Shaped from it, at the very beginning, by the wings of a tired old bird flying too close to the ground. That is the buried truth the legend walked right past. The real story is not hidden in a government vault. It was published over a century ago, and it is more beautiful than the fiction. And the creation story was only the beginning of what Mooney gathered. The Cherokee told him about the giants who once lived in these ranges. The greatest of them was a being they called Tzul'kalu', which the settlers later softened into the name Judakula. He was a giant of the high country, slant-eyed, the master of all the game animals, and he lived in the deep mountains where no one dared to hunt without his leave. He was said to be so enormous that he could step from ridge to ridge, and that the marks of his passing were pressed into the very stone of the mountains. Here is where the tradition reaches out and touches something you can still go and put your hand on. In Jackson County, North Carolina, on the edge of the old Cherokee country, there is a boulder of soapstone lying in a field. It is covered, edge to edge, in carvings. Curling lines, figures, shapes that no one alive can fully read, cut into the rock by human hands so long ago that archaeologists measure their age in thousands of years. The Cherokee called it the place where Tzul'kalu' came down from his mountain, and they say one set of markings is the print of the giant's hand where he braced himself as he leapt. They call it Judakula Rock. It is real. You can visit it. And it is a genuine record left in stone by people whose full story we will never completely recover. Sitting quietly in the same mountains, the internet swears are hiding a lost civilization. The lost writing is real. It just is not the writing anyone was looking for. Mooney recorded something else too, something that cuts even closer to the legend. The Cherokee had a flood tradition of their own. In it, a man is warned by his faithful dog that a great flood is coming to drown the world, and he survives by building a raft and riding out the rising water, while everything familiar disappears beneath it. A deluge, a world washed away and remade. It is a story told by cultures all over the earth, and the Cherokee were no exception. So when someone claims the Cherokee spoke of a great flood, they are not entirely wrong. The Cherokee did carry a flood story. It simply has nothing to do with mud burying the Smokies in 1888, and everything to do with the oldest kind of memory a people can hold. Now here is where a careful person has to stop and ask an honest question. Is any of this connected to the real geology of these mountains? Because it would be easy to get carried away, and the whole point of actually looking is that we do not get carried away. So let's look at what the science says. And the science, in its own way, is just as humbling. The Appalachians, the mountain family the Smokies belong to, are among the oldest mountains on the entire planet. We are not talking thousands of years. We are talking hundreds of millions. These ranges were rising and colliding and folding before there were dinosaurs, before there were flowers, before life had truly filled the land at all. When geologists reconstruct what these mountains once were, the number they arrive at is genuinely hard to hold in your head. The ancient Appalachians are believed to have stood as tall as the Alps. Some estimates push them toward the scale of the Himalayas. Look at the Smokies now. Soft, rounded, green, gentle. Nothing about them looks like the roof of the world. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. And that is the point. Everything that made them tall has been coming down for hundreds of millions of years. Rain and ice and root and river have been grinding those peaks apart grain by grain and carrying the pieces downhill and packing them into the valleys for longer than the human mind can really process. The soft, deep soil under this forest is the ground-up bones of mountains that once scraped the sky. So when the Cherokee said the land here was shaped when the earth was soft, they were not writing a geology textbook. But they were not entirely wrong about the character of the place either. This is a landscape defined by things wearing down, settling, filling in, and burying what came before. That is not a catastrophe theory. That is just what these mountains are, and have always been. And here is where the legend gets its most powerful ammunition, because these mountains really do produce their own mudfloods. Not a global one, not a hidden one, but real, violent, local ones. They are called debris flows. When a hard rain sits over these steep slopes for long enough, the saturated soil on a mountainside can simply let go. And when it lets go, it does not slide politely. It liquefies. Soil, rock, whole trees, everything on the slope collapses into a single churning wave of mud and moves downhill with terrifying speed and force. It can strip a mountainside down to bare rock. It can rearrange a valley in minutes. It can bury whatever sits at the bottom under a wall of earth and stone and shattered timber. People who live in these mountains know this. It is written into the landscape if you know how to read it. Those long, pale scars you sometimes see running straight down a green ridge are the tracks where the mountain gave way and slid, and if you look closely you can often see the pile of debris fanned out at the bottom where it finally came to rest. That fan is a burial. Whatever was there before is under it now. And in the worst storms, in the worst years, these flows have swept away roads, torn out bridges, buried homes and taken lives. In living memory, on ground people know by name. The mud flood is not a myth here. It is a weather event. It happens on a Tuesday. It is just a lot smaller and a lot more real than the version with the Lost Empire attached. And the people who have watched a hillside come down in the dark do not need a conspiracy to explain what mud can do to whatever stands beneath it. So the raw materials of the legend are all here. Mountains that bury things, a forest that swallows buildings, fog that hides whole valleys, real mud that really does come down and cover what stands below it, and an old tradition about land pulled from a flood and shaped while it was still soft. You can see exactly how a person could stitch all of that together into a story about a buried world. The pieces are genuine. It is only the conclusion that is invented, but we still have not found the buried people, and that is the part that matters most, because there is a buried people in this story. Two of them, actually. One belongs to legend, one belongs to history, and the history is the one that should stop you cold. Let's take the legend first, because the Cherokee themselves told Mooney about a hidden people in these mountains. They called them the Nunahi. The name means something close to the people who live anywhere, or the immortals. In the old Cherokee understanding, the Nunhai were a race of spirit people who lived inside these mountains, under the peaks, beneath the balds, in townhouses, hidden in the high places, where no ordinary person could find them. They were not ghosts. They were not enemies. They were a whole society, living and thriving, just out of sight, beneath the ground the Cherokee walked on every day. Travellers told stories of hearing them. A hunter alone in the high country would hear drums and dancing and singing coming up out of the mountain, from a townhouse he could never quite locate. Sometimes the Nunahi were said to appear to lost or freezing travellers, to guide them home, to feed them, to save them, and then to vanish. And in the darkest chapters of Cherokee history, when the people faced destruction, some traditions say the Mooney offered to take them in, to let entire towns come down into the mountain and live forever, safe beneath the earth. There is a buried civilization in the Cherokee tradition of these mountains. It is the Mooney, and it was never lost, because it was never meant to be found. It was always down there, in the story, living under the same blue smoke, in a world beneath the world. Now hold that image, the idea of a whole people disappearing into these mountains to survive, and turn from the legend to the record, because it happened. Not with spirits, with families, with names. By the 1830s, the Cherokee were one of the largest and most established nations in the southeast. They had towns, they had farms. They had a written language, invented by a Cherokee man named Sequoyah, and they printed a newspaper in it. By the standards the United States claimed to value, they had built exactly the kind of settled, literate society they were supposedly being asked to become. And it did not save them, because there was gold in the southern mountains, and there was land, and the people who wanted both had the power to take them. What followed was one of the darkest acts in the country's history. The Cherokee, along with other southeastern nations, were forced from their homelands and marched more than 1,000 miles west to territory that is now Oklahoma. Thousands died on the way, from cold, from hunger, from disease, from simple exhaustion and grief. The Cherokee remember it as Nunadal-Suni, the trail where they cried. History remembers it as the Trail of Tears. That is your buried civilization. It is not hidden under mud. It was carried off at gunpoint, and an entire built world, an entire way of life rooted in these mountains for centuries, was emptied out in a matter of years. If you are looking for a great people who were here, who built and farmed and wrote and worshipped, and who were then erased from the land almost overnight, you do not need a lost empire. You do not need Tartaria. You have the Cherokee. And it is not a theory. It is written down, in painful detail, in the record of the government that did it. But remember the remnant. Remember the ones who refused. When the soldiers came to round up the Cherokee, not everyone went. In these mountains, in the highest and hardest and most hidden country, a group of Cherokee slipped away from the roundup and vanished into the ridges. They hid in the caves and the laurel thickets and the deep hollows, in exactly the kind of country where the Nunhai were said to live, and the mountains hid them. The same folded, fog-drowned, impossible terrain that makes these peaks feel like they are hiding something is the terrain that let a people disappear into it and survive. They became the eastern band of the Cherokee. They are still here, and a generation later, it was their elders that James Mooney sat down with, and it was their memory that he wrote into the pages we can still read today. The story survived because the people survived. They went into the mountains, like the old tradition said, and the mountains kept them, and they were not the last people these mountains would swallow. There is a second buried world in the Smokies, more recent, and its bones are still standing if you know where to walk. Long after the Cherokee were driven out, settlers moved into these coves and hollows and built lives of their own. Places with names like Cades Cove and Cataloochee and Elkmont filled up with farms and churches and schools and mills. Whole communities, generations deep, grew up under the blue smoke. Then, in the early part of the last century, the decision was made to turn these mountains into a national park, and to make that park, the people living inside its boundaries had to go. Some sold willingly. Many did not, and were removed anyway, their land taken and their homes emptied. When the Great Smoky Mountains National Park was established, a living, working landscape of human beings was quietly cleared out of it, and the forest was allowed to take back everything they left behind. Go there now and you will find it. Cabins, standing alone in the trees with no road left to reach them, a white church in a clearing with a graveyard beside it, and no congregation for miles. Chimneys rising out of the undergrowth where a house used to be, the house itself, long gone, rotted and sunk into the very soil we talked about at the start. The hungry ground that grows up over anything you leave behind. It is not a lost empire. It is not a cover-up. But it is, without any exaggeration, a buried world. People lived there, Then they were gone, and the mountains covered the evidence, exactly the way the mountains always do. So let's come back to where we started, and be honest about what we found. The internet promised us a documented Cherokee record of a mud flood burying the Smokies in 1888, hidden by people who did not want us to know, and that specific thing does not exist. There is no secret report. There is no cover-up of a catastrophe. That version is fiction wearing the costume of history. But look at everything the search actually turned up along the way. A real man, in that real era, writing down real Cherokee tradition. A creation story in which the entire earth is mud pulled up out of a flood of water. A telling in which these exact mountains were shaped while the ground was still soft. A landscape that genuinely buries buildings, that genuinely produces walls of mud when the rains come, and that is genuinely built from the ground-down remains of mountains that once rivaled the Himalayas. A tradition of a whole civilization living hidden beneath these peaks. And a true history of a great nation that really was erased from this land, and a remnant that really did escape by disappearing into the mountains themselves. The legend is not true, but it is not empty either. It is a distorted echo. It is what happens when a real feeling, the feeling that these mountains are hiding something, that a world has been lost here, gets separated from the real story that gave it life. Somebody felt the weight of these hollows and reached for a lost empire, when the real lost world was right there in the record the whole time, more human and more heartbreaking than any invented one. That is worth thinking about the next time you see one of these theories. The mud flood, Tartaria, all of it. The people who believe them are not usually chasing a lie for its own sake. They are chasing a feeling. The feeling that something real and great came before us and was taken away, quietly, by forces that did not want us to remember. And the strange, sad truth is that, in these particular mountains, under this particular blue smoke, that feeling is pointing at something real. It is just not pointing where they think. There is a strange mercy in how this turns out, if you sit with it. The people who spread the mud flood story are reaching for a lost world, and they are reaching in the wrong direction, past the real one, toward an empire that never existed. But the reaching itself is not crazy. It is human. We know, somewhere deep down, that the ground we stand on is thick with people who came before us, and that most of them have been forgotten, and that forgetting feels like a wound, even when we cannot name whose it is. These mountains hold two buried worlds that we can actually prove. A nation carried off along a trail of tears, and a scattering of mountain communities cleared out and left to the forest. Both were real. Both were covered over. Both are still here if you are willing to look at the hard version instead of the exciting one. The tragedy is not that the truth was hidden. The tragedy is that the truth is sad, and a lost empire is thrilling, and people would rather feel thrilled than feel grief. The buried world is here. It always was. It is a people, not an empire. It is written down, not hidden, and you do not have to dig for it. You only have to be willing to look at what actually happened, which is harder and stranger and far more worth remembering than any story about mud. The Eastern Band is still in these mountains today, still speaking the language Mooney once strained to follow, still carrying the stories that outlived the soldiers and the surveyors and every attempt to end them. The record he left is not a relic. It is a bridge back to voices that refuse to go silent. The Cherokee said the land was born from mud, shaped soft by the wings of a tired old bird. They said giants once walked these ridges and left their handprints in the stone, and that a hidden people lived beneath these peaks and welcomed the desperate in. And when their own destruction came, a piece of them did exactly what the old story described. They went into the mountains. And the mountains, wrapped in their endless blue smoke, kept them safe and kept their memory, long enough for us to finally sit still and listen. So the next time the blue smoke rises off these ridges, and that old whisper starts up in the back of your mind, the one that says something down there is hidden, do not reach for the empire, reach for the truth. Because the whisper is right. Something is down there. Something was covered over. A world did end here, and another one nearly did, and the proof is not buried in mud at all. It is standing in a field on a carved grey rock. It is written in the pages of a man who bothered to listen. It is walking around these mountains today, speaking a language that was supposed to be gone. The lost world of the Smokies was never lost. It was only waiting for someone to stop chasing the legend and start remembering the people